Breaking news today. Putin is dying to fight the West in order to rationalize heavy casualties. Putin is trying to legitimize Russia's heavy casualties on the battlefield by portraying the invasion of Ukraine as a struggle against the West. This evaluation by the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, comes after the Russian president met with injured servicemen on New Year's Day in a military hospital. According to the American think tank, Putin might be changing his war goals to include confrontation with the West in an effort to set conditions for permanent Russian military buildup and to justify high battlefield sacrifices. Despite over 250,000 casualties, Russian forces have failed to make significant territory gains in 2023, according to Ukraine's data. Meanwhile, the British Ministry of Defence reported on December 30 that daily casualty numbers had soared by about 300 in the last 12 months. According to a December 2015 U.S. intelligence study, Russia has lost 315,000 soldiers since the war began, and the UK has predicted that by the end of 2024, Russia would have lost over 500,000 soldiers. According to the ISW, Putin was probably prompted to provide an ideological justification to prolong the conflict he initiated, which will celebrate its second anniversary on February 24. Following such high losses for very few gains, reporters from Newsweek reached out to the Kremlin for comment, to posture himself as an empathetic and involved wartime leader even while seemingly raising the stakes to support his demands for increasing sacrifices by his people. The ISW stated of Putin's response to worries about housing and compensations for wounded troops. Putin's statements likely suggest that he is preparing a long-term justification to keep forces mobilized and engaged in combat for the perpetual defense of Russia's sovereignty against the West. According to the report, the Kremlin website published a transcript of Putin's meeting with soldiers, which revealed that, instead of Ukraine, Putin had referred to the West as the enemy. Putin explained to a serviceman that Ukraine by itself is not an enemy, but that the true enemies were Western-based players who want to destroy Russian statehood. In answering his inquiry, this phrasing implies that Putin sees a conflict and potential negotiations between Russia and the West, not a conflict and potential negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. The ISW said, adding that this demonstrated Putin's strategy of strategically positioning the West to betray Ukraine in negotiations by creating the necessary informational conditions. Putin is likely deliberately and falsely framing Ukraine as pawn without agency in the Russia-West conflict to mask his expansionist and maximalist goals of establishing full effective Russian control of Ukraine. According to the research organization, a magnificent career arc has been completed by Vladimir Putin. In 2000, he brought stability to Russia and ended the fight between organized crime gangs, ushering in the age of Putinism. In just over a year, he has plunged the nation into a violent orgy. Russia is experiencing its first increase in murders and attempted murders in 20 years. In exchange for a few months of terrorizing their towns on the front lines of Ukraine, Putin has offered the greatest murderers and sadists financial compensation and freedom from Russia's jails. Russian Ministry of Interior Affairs data shows a 29.7% spike in armed crimes over the past 10 months, and prominent figures in civil society are forecasting an even larger tidal surge of violence. Crimes perpetrated by Russian servicemen returning from Ukraine reverberate throughout the nation, creating an echo of war, as the Russians put it. One of them, Yuri Gavrilov, raped a schoolgirl in Soliletsk when he returned from Ukraine. The girl was 11 years old. Some have done homicide, robbery, and arson. Despite requests from the Kremlin's propagandists, word of the crimes perpetrated by returning soldiers in October has begun making its way out. Putin was asked about the books he was reading at his annual televised question and answer session last month. According to TASS, the Russian state news agency, Putin said with irony, "I will reread the criminal code." It sent a strong message to the alternative media. Putin has killed thousands of people, both Russian and Ukrainian, in his war in Ukraine in 2023, but he smiles and jokes, laughing at Russians, insider Timur Alevsky told the Daily Beast. Reunited with gangster techniques. He has recovered. For what reason, then, is Putin rebuilding the gangster state and wreaking havoc in Russia? Putin is attempting to instill fear in society. according to Svetlana Ganushkina, a Civic Assistance Committee leader and human rights defender based in Moscow. Vladislav Kanyas, who was sentenced to 17 years in prison for the 111 stab wounds inflicted on 23-year-old Vera Pektalieva, was released early, a fact she emphasized. The man who stabbed his girlfriend multiple times must have been mentally ill, Ganushkina adds, and we watch him pardoning him. The fact that the girl's family is terrified to hear this news should come as no surprise to anybody. Pektalieva is terrified at night by every creak in the floor. According to her childhood best friend, who declined to be named, who spoke with the Daily Beast, after the state-funded military business Wagner recruited 50,000 inmates from Russian jails nationwide, the recruitment of incarcerated individuals became authorized in May, according to Russian officials. They are specifically looking for killers, stated Olga Romanova, head of Russia Behind Bars, speaking to the Daily Beast. Putin seems to be endorsing a religion of death. It is obvious that the Kremlin has not prioritized dealing with crime and violence within Russia. To all appearances, the more bloodshed and murder there is, the better. In response to footage showing his son, who is 16 years old, brutally assaulting a helpless prisoner, Chechen Republic leader and Putin confidant Ramzan Kadyrov stated that he would not punish his son. Should I punish them? Why was it done? Defeating him physically? Kadyrov stated last month that it would have been preferable if he had murdered him. Olga Bychkova, a veteran observer of the Kremlin, calls Putin's spiral into violence the evergreen story of autocracies that oppress their own people domestically while showing off their might abroad. By pardoning murderers this year, Putin has effectively suspended the rule of law. As something that has no place in a rational society, he cancelled that notion out. The mandate for violence has been lifted. And now everyone can be violent, not just the state. According to Bychkova, Putin is simply blurring and unclearing the boundaries. As reported by the Daily Beast, as usual, minorities were the first to face the effects of Putin's crackdown at home. The LGBT movement, which has been persecuted for a long time, was outlawed as extremist, and over 500 political prisoners were sent to prison. Furthermore, Russian women faced restrictions on their ability to access abortions. My hometown of Nizhny Novgorod was one of the first districts to suggest banning abortions in private clinics. On the other hand, domestic abuse was decriminalized with Putin's blessing, and no local lawmakers sought to alter that. There is a severe lack of affordable treatment. Hundreds of thousands of people are affected by the HIV epidemic, and millions more are living in poverty or have died without the support of the state. For expressing opposition to the conflict in Ukraine or even for making social media comments, regular Russians and journalists were often jailed by the police. This year, we took the mask off. According to Nestat, the legal director of the docket at the Clooney Foundation for Justice, CFJ, Russia don't bother anymore when it comes to respecting international conventions, while certain dictatorships, like the Soviet Union's, are able to endure for decades. History repeatedly demonstrates that this is not the case. Particularly in cases where the oppressor inflicts terrible injustice upon their populations, human rights advocates like Nestat, with headquarters in Kiev, are meticulously investigating and documenting Russia's atrocities before bringing them before international tribunals. The right to exist is a fundamental human right, as stated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Up until the conflict in Ukraine, we had the impression that people around the world placed a high importance on this right, in order to help 16 families who lost loved ones in the atrocities committed by Russian commanders in Ukraine. Nestat and the CFJ team spent 6 months gathering evidence and conducting investigations into 3 separate cases. She just recently reported the incidents to federal prosecutors in Germany, who will be looking into them further. The brutal Russian attacks on Ukraine have continued unabated despite Western sanctions and an arrest warrant presented to Putin earlier this year by the International Criminal Court, despite accusations that 617,000 Russians are fighting in Ukraine. Putin has maintained his stated objectives of denazification, demilitarization, and neutral status and is busy informing Russians about them. More than 315,000 Russian troops have been wounded or killed since the Russian army was pushed into Ukraine, according to U.S. intelligence reports on the cost of Putin's war. Counting casualties on the home front adds an additional chilling figure. But it appears that Putin will not let anything stand in his way of being re-elected president in 2024 and extending his term in office by 6 years.